neben mir links befindet sich Herr Dr. Kulikov Dmitrij Alexandrovich. Er ist Vizerektor für wissenschaftliche Arbeit an dem GO. Ja, darf ich Ihnen vorstellen? Herr Kulikow spricht wunderbar Englisch, deswegen seit dieser Zeit beginnen wir Englisch sprechen und ich gerne erteile das Wort Herrn Kulikow.
Dear colleagues, I am very happy to greet you, and it's a big honor for me to introduce Professor Mihaël Штеппат from Germany, a famous scientist. So for me, it's a big day because I hope that today's event is a kind of symbol that our hearts, our minds are open for new information, for collaboration, because the borders are closed now. And I also hope that new technologies, new machines will not rise against us, but will help us to communicate with our colleagues all over the world. So today's lecture of Professor Штеппат calls modern literary theory in cultural contexts. I wish that it will be a very interesting and productive collaboration, discussion. And Professor Штеппат, the floor is yours. And we are very happy to open our event and your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you, and I do hope that you can hear me adequately and that our acoustic arrangement is satisfactory for today's event. Very nice. Then I will open my presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And I'm happy that this seems to be working very smoothly. Thank you for all your efforts in preparing today's event. So I should say good afternoon to everybody who is assembled to attend this guest lecture. And I would like to extend a warm greeting to all of you in this digital format, which of course, as you know, is a precaution owing to the COVID epidemic. It's indeed a privilege and a great pleasure for me to be allowed to address you at this time. I hope you can all hear me adequately and you can understand me. Just let me know if there is ever any problem with that. So I want to thank your university, and I want to thank Dr. Makarchenko very much for the invitation to address you. And I assume that those attending, or the majority of those attending, are doctoral students at MGOU at Moscow Regional State University. Hope I'm getting the name right. And I imagine that surely you have a solid background in studying foreign literary culture. I don't know anything, however, about your actual preparation level in terms of modern and critical theory. So I may be partly talking about things that you already know. And if that happens at any point, please don't hesitate to let me know. You can probably raise a hand, you can use this Zoom channel, and then you can let me know, and then we could skip something which you already know. Or, on the other hand, if I'm assuming too much about your preparation, and anything is difficult or unclear, then likewise, I would invite you to ask me for clarification. And you can do this at just about any time. Okay, so indeed, it's my pleasure to welcome you warmly to this event. Your lecturer today is Professor Mihaël Штеппат. I'm a regular visiting professor at Shanghai International Studies University and professor of literature and English at the University of Bayreuth in Germany. I'm a project leader in the National Excellence Strategy Cluster, in the cluster group entitled, or research section titled Traveling Knowledge. And I've done theory-based research in several books such as Cross-Cultural Literary Representations of Honor Cultures and Face Cultures, and also Literature and Interculturality, which runs to 3 volumes. Also, I do teach regular postgraduate theory courses. So this is a brief profile of the person who is currently speaking to you. So this is where we begin our voyage of exploration. I'm planning to have us do some thinking together. First, what we need to do is we need to think about what we mean when we use the term literature. And then from there, secondly, we should ask about modern theory. We should try to understand why some people believe that theories are indispensable when we approach literature. And then from there, thirdly, where does culture come into this? And what is the place of literature within concepts of culture in our time? And that will be a vital aspect of our discussion. Then from there, topic number 4, we'll briefly look at the core ideas of a few influential theories. Now, much of this will seem somewhat abstract. Theory just is theory, it's abstract. But surely, I imagine that you have already demonstrated a fine capacity for abstraction in order to become successful doctoral students. But it will not all be abstract. Because as you will see, this is not just about any remote ideas floating somewhere out there. It's also, in a very immediate sense, about you and me. And then from there, once we have an understanding of that, we can focus on topic number 5, because we'll be in a position to consider, as an illustration, how an awareness of theory can have an impact on ways to understand a literary work. And for this investigation, I've chosen Shakespeare's major tragedy, Hamlet. We will approach this together bit by bit. So if you do not have a strong knowledge of this particular work, this drama, then we will build the necessary information that we need together. So that is the roadmap, as it were, the menu of what awaits you in this lecture. So I would like to begin by having us think for a moment about our key terms and what we are talking about. We should ask, what range of meanings does this term literature have? Terry Eagleton has given this some thought. For a long time now, various concepts have been proposed about what literature is. We could understand literature as imaginative writing in the sense of fiction. And in this understanding, we're talking about writing which is not referentially true. It features invented things, invented characters, and events, and settings. Where do we get these? We get these in novels. We get them in poetry. We get them in drama. Spontaneously, we might think that is pretty much on the mark. And yet, is that adequate? In our time, there is more. We get comics, we get graphic novels, we get cyberpunk, we get movies, we get TV series, and we even get the narrative sequences in computer games and video games. Are any of these worth studying as literature? You might possibly remember that in the English 17th century, stage dramas were not considered to be high literature. And that includes William Shakespeare's dramas. It includes Hamlet, the world-famous tragedy, which we're going to talk about in the final part of today's lecture. So this is a range of possible variations of our understanding of literature. So in that age, the early modern age, a much wider range comes into any notion of what literature is. We get, for instance, a unique spiritual autobiography. We get essays which are witty and aphoristic on all topics of current interest. We get religious sermons. And we also get books refuting and rejecting what we would now call fake news, with involvement of what we would call scientific journalism. All of these were understood as being literary. Then in France, and as you probably realize, the culture of France closely interacts with the English in many periods. There are still more kinds of literary writing in that age in French. Then in the 19th century, the range expands again with historical writing and with very influential discussions of liberty. We can consider these, all of these, as extensions of the term literature. We study such works in literary courses. I wonder if you happen to know of any quasi-fictional works that you would not simply call literary works, from your understanding? Then, in our own time again, the English newspaper, The Guardian, calls our attention to the fact that a growing number of new books and e-books, electronic books, interactively mix historical fact with first-person fictionalized accounts, and even, in some cases, with embedded videos. This is what we call multi-screening, and it's expanding the range of what we call literature for our time. I wonder if you have ever come across any works of multi-screening. The great cultural theorist Walter Benjamin, in an essay early in the 20th century, had something to say about this, and you'll see that here on this slide. Benjamin predicted in the early 20th century that in fully developed capitalism, there emerges a form of communication that confronts storytelling as no less of a stranger than did the novel, but in a more menacing way. And it brings about a crisis in the novel. This new form of communication is information. That was a quote from Walter Benjamin. We have an example of how this happens. And we find this in a work of American literature. In his novel, which you see here, Bright Shiny Morning, author James Frey creates a portrait of Los Angeles, the urban conglomeration, and he does so by inserting factual sections, not just fictional, factual sections on everything from the construction of the Los Angeles road system to statistics on prostitution and on gang violence, so that we hear about the underworld of Los Angeles. Sociologists such as Zygmunt Bauman are helpful here to help us understand this. If you have ever heard of Zygmunt Bauman, well, Bauman tells us that our modern world is a world of constant fragmentation and of mixing of genres and of lifestyles. This means that narratives of the traditional life story are breaking down into unrelated pieces. To understand this, you might just consider ourselves. You and I are likely to work in several jobs over a lifetime. We're likely to have several sexual partners during our life. We move location. We start again and again in a world which is characterized by self-selling, where we sell, as it were, ourselves. And this world is deregulated. It is privatized. Well, perhaps all that does not happen in Russia, but it does, in my experience of the so-called West, and, in fact, of China. By analogy, then, we live in virtual places just as much as we do in real empirical places. So facts become blurred. We may be living out fictions in our real life. I wonder if this matches anything in your own experience. If you just think again of William Shakespeare. In his drama Hamlet, we have the fairly central character of Queen Gertrude. We might remember that in the extra-dramatic political culture around 1600, and therefore in real life, the figure of an aging and sexually evocative female monarch appears as a troubling frame for the theater. So how much of this performance is fiction? What this consideration means is that there is an alternative presence and absence of the real and the virtual, the real and the imaginary. And we will encounter such a mutuality of presence and absence again. You'll find these two key terms, absence and presence, right here on this slide, and they will engage our attention again in several contexts. Perhaps literature has always been like this, featuring degrees of such interplay of the real and of the imaginary. In our time, the real and the virtual. We might consider in this context that in the late 16th century, the word novel in English had a different meaning from the modern meaning. Nowadays, the word novel means narrative fiction. But a few centuries ago, the term novel could refer to both true events and fictional events. And even news reports were hardly thought of as being factual necessarily. So the terms and categories that we are dealing with are subject to historical change and to historical modification. Such a development is not easy to understand and to grasp without some guiding concepts. And right here, we can pass on to our second particular topic, our second topic section. So this is our second topic section. Whether we are looking at previous centuries or in our own time, we need guides. We need more powerful lenses in order to try and grasp what is going on, how the fictions, the fictional works that surround us relate to the society and the culture of which we are a part. And that is an important reason why some people think that theories, especially modern theories, are indispensable. So a distinction between fact and fiction does not get us very far. It does not include us. It does not include our social experience. So with a distinction between fact and fiction, we seem to be somehow outside of any interplay, as if our life was mostly or entirely factual, our own life. But is it? Talking or thinking about fiction as if fiction were an object out there, detached from us. Well, talking and thinking like that could do without any modern theory. But we should ask, is that the way things really are? You might ask yourself, how much of my own life is factual? Are there any fictions embedded in my own life? And this is a question that can get us very close to understanding why literature and modern theory depend on each other. But you see, literature is never detached from us. We may be creating little fictions about our own life and within our own life. And we always approach literary works in light of our own concerns, the questions and interests of our own time and of our own culture, all the way to ourselves as individuals. And that's actually an important reason why good literature appeals to people across centuries. Such works appear to retain their value, no matter when and where they are encountered. Nowadays, we read Leo Tolstoy, and we enjoy reading Tolstoy's works, even though he wasn't writing for us. He wasn't writing for readers so far in the future. So we create such works anew for ourselves, for our own time, for our culture. This means that our Mark Twain is not the Mark Twain as he was understood in his own time. And all literary works, we might gather, are rewritten by the cultures which read them. And correspondingly, as Terry Eagleton phrases it, a reading of a literary work is a rewriting. So your reading, my reading, is actually a form of rewriting. This process extends to new groups of people. It extends to new reading environments, such as ours. And whenever this happens, any work gets transformed. Any work changes its shape. And as a consequence, what we think of as literature, fixed between the covers of a book which you can pull from the shelf, and it will always show you exactly the same face, it will always have the same material constitution, is actually a rather unstable affair. I wonder if you would agree that literature gets transformed when new approach it. I think I'm not getting through. Okay, I was muted just now. I hope you can hear me again. Okay, so I was saying that literature gets transformed, but I wonder if you would agree that that happens when you approach it. I wonder if you would agree that your approach, your reading, your reception of literature, whatever literature means, amounts to a rewriting. I wonder if you would agree. In any case, for these reasons, it is impossible, isn't it, to make any statements about literature that is factually objective, that is neutral, that is not involved, that is free from partiality. Isn't it impossible to make any such statement? Or is that a gross exaggeration? What do you think? And here we need the next slide. Okay, so this is our next slide. So you might say, oh yes, there is factual knowledge. We can say when Mark Twain's Life on the Mississippi was first published. We can say when the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow was built. But one can say such things in a particular context. That's what usually happens. Interpreting the sociocultural conditions prevailing at the time these artifacts were created, and making inferences about what we think of those conditions and how we understand them. In this light, all of our descriptive, seemingly factual statements move within a network of value categories. And this is a network of which we are not always aware. Value categories, in fact, are so deeply ingrained within our minds that we would not communicate with each other if we did not operate within such categories. I'm sure that I am feeding on certain semi-conscious value categories right now in speaking to you. So our factual knowledge isn't the whole story. It wouldn't make sense to us if we don't make use of our judgment. And our judgment depends on our values. Eagleton introduces the term ideology to explain this context. Does this term mean something to you, I wonder? We can understand ideology as an often hidden structure of values, and this lies beneath the factual statements that we make. Ideology is a way of linking up what we think and believe with the power structure and the power relations of the society in which we live. It informs our use of language, the way we communicate. It probably informs what I'm doing right now, just as it informs the way we think of ourselves. But is it there all the time? I would suggest that we cannot simply wish or pretend it isn't there, or to think that it only affects others and not us, not our own positioning. Ideology always affects the others, but not me, right? Well, I wonder if you can think of any ways in which ideology operates as a hidden value structure. Do you think it can affect objective factual statements? Can you possibly trace this in your own thinking, your own value structures? Or do you find no trace of ideologies in your own mental operations? Well, this is important because it will show whether modern theory appears plausible to you or whether it does not. So you should ask yourself this. And when you do so, you might consider the guideline bracketing, which you'll find among the PDF lecture materials. So in your own good time, you could open that and you could take a look at it. This is an insight and a realization which you might find very strange, or you might find that it can reveal something about your own assumptions, which include ideological assumptions. You see, theorists will tell you and me that our practical critical operations always rest on some theoretical perspective, and that is in the shape of a hidden assumption, hidden even to ourselves. We might try to place our own positions beyond any such inquiry, and we might take our positions to be common sense and simply given. Common sense comes from the Latin sensus communis, and it tells us that things usually have one single meaning, and that this meaning is obvious to all. That is, the world is pretty much the way we see it and the way we hear it. And our perception is natural, isn't it? It's self-evident, and everybody must see it this way. We know that the sun goes round the earth because we can see that it does, don't we? Or, well, I know graduate students who think that good Chinese writers are good because they describe the pleasant and attractive quality of social life in China. And when they do that, they must be good writers. Common sense, once again. But are any of these objective assumptions? It is quite similar with the notion that certain literary classics appeal to what we call human nature, the second major term which you'll find right here on this slide. Human nature is a very general category which goes beyond the limitations of a particular race or gender, social class, nationality, or region, or religion. Speaking of such a generalized humanity, however, tends to privilege certain human segments. It tends to privilege Eurocentric attitudes. It tends to privilege even androcentric attitudes, which means masculinist attitudes. And it tends to marginalize the perceptions of disadvantaged groups. And these can be ethnic minorities, they can be women, and they can be transgender people. And you might think of others as well. Now, again, that may not happen in Russia, but it does happen in much of the so-called West. So actually, many ideas which we might instinctively regard as being basic givens of our life are not really stable. And these involve our gender identity, our social class, our being Russian or German or Filipino, for that matter, and similar assumptions. But these are all actually fluid and unstable. They are not fixed at all. And that means they are socially and culturally constructed. So that, coming back to what we were discussing just now, even objective and factual statements may not be reliable. Now, all this might be very familiar ground to you. And if it is, we can skip it, and we can move further ahead if you like. You can just let me know. So if we believe that cultural conditions are stable, if we believe that gender identity is stable, if we believe that German people all have certain qualities, that Japanese people all have certain qualities, characteristics, if we believe that the language we use allows reliable insight into these, and that it enables clear communication, well, then we will not see the need for any modern theory. But is real life like that? This is for each of you to think about and to decide upon. Modern theory, at any rate, does not trust fixed essences, which a large number of individual entities have in common. And because of that, theory usually thinks of itself as anti-essentialist. So now that we're talking about cultural conditions, well, what is the place of literature in culture? And this brings us to our third topic segment. Okay, we need to switch the slide. And right now it is not yet moving. Here we are. Okay. So right here, as an extension of our line of questioning, I can offer you the additional little PDF file, History, Concept, Culture, which you'll find among the lecture materials. And this very briefly, much too briefly, summarizes, or attempts to summarize, how our understanding of culture has developed. If you look closely at this in your own good time, you'll find several concepts that suggest a place for literature. One is right here on the slide, the idea of high culture since the later 18th century. But we also get, for instance, cultural representations and their meanings, and also further categories that have played an important role in the unfolding of our thinking about culture. Maybe, as you look at that, you might find that some of this already suggests links with post-structuralism in our time. But we shouldn't jump too far ahead, and we should go forward step by step. So why should we ask about an idea of culture anyway? Well, let's see the next slide. When you open this slide, you'll find an answer to the question we just asked, the question about culture. So what you get here is the following. Culture is the most important thing to know about people if one wants to make predictions about their behavior. Culture is an important notion in the analysis of any social science or humanities, and its importance continues to spread. End of that quote. This is from a leading team of researchers who have given a comprehensive new account of notions of culture. You might notice that the main purpose, according to this assessment, is to make predictions about people's behavior. I wonder, what do you think of this? Would you think this is a key purpose for your own interest and for projects that you might like to do? And we might ask a further question about this, and this will appear on the next slide. Okay, here we are. We could ask, do all theories aim to make predictions? Is this a purpose of any kind of theories? A general purpose? We could think for a moment about this as a little excursus or extension from our immediate topic concerns, if you're interested. On this slide, you can find a classical distinction between two kinds of purpose. And this is as follows: one of two major kinds of purpose. There is prediction and explanation, which we get typically in the natural and social sciences. Or we get understanding and interpretation, with attention to hermeneutics as the theory and methodology of text interpretation. If you would like a more comprehensive account of this and of this distinction, you could consult the Encyclopedia of Political Theory in 2010, for instance. But what do we mean by explanation and by interpretation? Well, the next slide will hopefully give us an idea. So what we get here is the following. Explanation aims to reconstruct actions, and actions in the sense of purposive behavior, in terms of agents' perspective, agents are individual actors, and of causal mechanisms. Or it aims to develop accounts that have a robust predictive value. Then interpretation, as against explanation, interpretation aims to reflect or reconstruct the view of agents with respect to the events to be explained. And it also aims to draw conclusions about the meaning of a work of art. Okay, these are the two major purposes of theories. So when you think about this, could explanation become relevant for investigating anything about literature? Could causal mechanisms become an object of examination? We might consider also that data need reconstructive interpretation, including the data of authorial biography, just as a text needs interpretation, so that there can be some overlaps between purposes. What do you think? Well, we can follow this up further. Right here on this slide, you can find statements that are close to Baldwin's in the overview by Spencer Oty on what is culture. You'll find that in the PDF lecture materials to accompany the lecture. This excerpt here offers a distinction between norms that are relevant for a whole culture and those that are relevant for particular people who may have a hybrid identity. And when we get that, individual differences in constructs become salient. And these individual differences in constructs can become very important in the understanding of culture. So, hence, we need characterizations of the values of particular members of a culture or of groups to predict how those individuals will behave. So our question might be, can we learn something about the values of individuals and about the values shared within a group? If we can learn something about that, it might have predictive potential and it might even have reliability. Can literature help in that process? We might think about how far that appears possible, depending on how we understand culture. So how do we understand culture? Let's refocus our thinking about culture. And here we can return from the excursus to our main line of investigation. We've already touched on Spencer Oty's useful overview of notions of culture. I've met Helen Spencer Oty on more than one occasion, and I've learned quite a lot from her. So here's the title of this overview, which you have among your PDF lecture materials. If you open that PDF file, at first you may think it seems less relevant for you. On the second page of the overview, you can find a string of quotations from various sources in chronological order. You might wonder about that. Well, it's meant to be suggestive, but it doesn't explain much because a context is not yet apparent in these cases. So the actual discussion begins with a focus on the third page, page 3. And there, the discussion is based on management or business culture. Well, business culture? Isn't that so very remote from literature? Actually, you might be surprised. It's sometimes rather pertinent for understanding literature, whether you expected that or not. And what we get is the following. What you get here is that a distinction is made between different layers of depth in thinking about culture. So we can distinguish between what we can observe from outside and then less tangible, deeper or inside dimensions. So there are 3 levels of culture. We get A, observable artifacts. B, we get values. And C, we get underlying assumptions. So C underlies B and A. And as you see here, when one enters an organization, this is organizational studies, one observes and feels its artifacts. This category includes everything from the physical layout, the dress code, the manner in which people address each other, the smell and feel of the place, its emotional intensity, and other related phenomena. So you see, we can describe how a group constructs its environment. We can describe the group's behavior patterns, but we cannot describe the underlying logic. When you think about this, I wonder what experience you have regarding levels of culture. The things you can observe from outside, such as physical layout, and then the less visible underlying layers. Do you have experience with this distinction? Does this distinction make any sense to you? Could you name any instances of such a distinction from your own experience? Distinction between A and B and C? This discussion immediately leads to what we find on the next slide. This is still on page 3 of the overview where this excerpt is taken from. So in order to really understand a culture, one must delve into the underlying assumptions. That indeed is imperative. And these underlying assumptions are rarely found on the observable surface, and they are typically unconscious. You can read the rest of this statement in your own good time. Actually, we can put this insight or this argumentation into a graphic chart. And you can find that chart on page 4 of the overview. Here it is on our next slide. So what you see here is a helpful chart, I hope at least, to show these levels of culture. And when you look at it more closely, do you notice where literary art has its place? So here we get what we were talking about just now. We get these three values, three layers. One is what is observable. One is values, that is B. And then C, we have basic assumptions. So where could literary art have its place, if any, in all this? It's already, of course, you notice that right away, it's already right there at the top in artifacts and creations, where we find the visible surface of artworks and literary works. But watch out, just the visible, observable surface. Then to understand these, we can ask about underlying values, and we find that in the middle. From there, we get to the basic assumptions below the level of consciousness. Where do ideologies come in? Remember, we were discussing those. Well, ideologies can operate at the middle level, you see, the greater level of awareness. And quite effectively, ideologies can operate at the level of basic assumptions, where we might take them for granted and they might remain preconscious. I would ask you, why do you think there are arrows going up as well as down, and not only in one direction between these layers? How would you explain this? You might think about it. So perhaps, just possibly, it is literary works that can open the door to underlying values and to basic assumptions governing a culture and its members, with, and not ignoring, individual differentiation based on characters, fictional characters, whom we can think of as individuals, differentiable in individuals. One could go on from here to look further into the overview of the understanding of culture. And we could examine the place of literature as images and encodements of cultural representations. We'll find more about that on page 10 of the overview, if you care to follow that up in your own good time. So it's worth looking carefully at that overview of the understanding of concepts of culture. So perhaps you will find this overview of core concepts of culture helpful. I wonder if it helps your own thinking about culture at all. The overview also calls attention here and there to the importance of language for cultural communication. Let's consider this for a moment. How do we use language? Obviously, that's what we're doing right now. I'm speaking to you in this lecture across countries. We may believe, we may hope that language allows reliable insight into the world around us. But how well is that hope grounded? This will be our next question. So as we consider literature's place in concepts of culture, we can call to mind that language is a tool which we use for communication. And we like to think that we're in control of that tool and of that communicative process. We want to meet somebody, we discuss that on the phone, and then we assume that the person at the other end, the person we're talking to on the phone, will indeed understand that I want to meet that person at, let's say, 5 o'clock in a certain office or maybe in a restaurant. So we're in control of the communicative process. But are we really? Can we be sure of that? Since the later 19th century, in some observations by Friedrich Nietzsche, the idea has gained ground that language does not just record and reflect our real life. Rather, it is language itself that conditions our life, that limits our life, and predetermines our life. This has then become a key argument of structuralism. And this point is where I want to move on to our main topic, number 4, in order to introduce some theories. So, right now, here, with a little simplification, I'm afraid, we can look at the core ideas of 2 or 3 major and influential modern theories. I must apologize for simplifying because simplification is just inevitable. First among these, for our purposes then, is structuralism. If language, as we were just discussing, if language does not just record our life, then we need to see that reality is constructed by means of language. And if that is so, maybe it's a big if, but if that is so, nothing is simply out there as an objective reality to which language gives access. Rather, just about everything is a linguistic and even a textual construct. In other words, language doesn't just communicate reality. It doesn't just do that instrumentally for our conscious mind. Rather, language shapes and creates that reality for us before there is ever anything to communicate. I wonder if that makes any sense to you. Have you ever experienced situations in which language conditions and determines our life? Or is that grossly exaggerated? You might like to think about this, and maybe you already have. Quite likely, you already have. At any rate, this is a key structuralist idea. And it can show us that language, with its powerful implications, has become a major paradigm of 20th century intellectual life, reaching into our time. Thus, for instance, the linguistic concepts of structuralism influenced Russian formalism, to which we owe a lot nowadays. And beyond that, they have been a stimulus for quite a range of theoretical concepts which continue to shape our thinking. So we can think of structuralism as a theory that concentrates largely on language and on text. There is an anthology of literary theory, modern literary theory, by Rifkin and Ryan. The second edition came out in 2004. And that is ideally among your materials to accompany this lecture, so that you can look this up at any time in your materials. The Anthology of Literary Theory by Rifkin and Ryan. And there you will find an excerpt from Ferdinand de Saussure's course in general linguistics, which can help us to understand these early structuralist assumptions. We'll have more about these in a moment. After the time of de Saussure, we have Claude Lévi-Strauss. And what we get there is Lévi-Strauss, 2 major works. There is the structural study of myth, and there is his book, The Raw and the Cooked, Mythologie, Mythologique, Volume 1 in this case. And such works lay ground for exploring bundles of relations in studying mythical text relations. In other words, not individual elements and items. For our purposes, this approach is actually quite practical. We can be grateful to Lévi-Strauss for working these out. Why? Well, you see, perhaps you know this quite well, but structuralism tries to find patterns which are built up within a text. And structuralism then uses such patterns in order to find similar patterns in other texts. Such patterns are often, though not always, binary. and that means they often consist of opposites. And these form stable pairs, and they relate to each other. And these include dark and light, old and young, father and son, good and evil, country and city, and others like these. Many, many others like these. You can hunt for such pairs. And hunting of this kind can almost become a game, an intellectual game, and a cognitive game. Can you think of any literary works that you know in which you could easily spot any opposed thematic pairs and bundles? Have you ever practiced this yourself? And if you did, were you satisfied with what you did? So in such a way, any single text and any single work belongs to a larger group of works, and it doesn't exist in isolation. So structuralist analysis is not very interested in aesthetic forms of language use, and it's not very interested in rhetorical analysis. It's interested rather in thematic patterning, which forms a structure in a work and across works. So it's readers who perceive and set up such patterns. These are not an inherent quality within a text, but still, analyzing such patterns appears as almost an objective form of study, which does not need subjective responses. It does not need emotive responses. And that has been a major attraction of structuralist thought and methodology. So for this reason, is structuralism really suited to an aesthetically organized text? We could ask that question. But structuralism does invite us to ask, what kinds of logically related categories can we perceive in a work? Categories that are opposed and that are set off against each other. And also, how does the individual work belong to a larger class or group? Okay, so that was our first major station in this development of theory with our discussion of structuralism. I wonder whether you think this is actually possible. Is it possible to focus on abstract-looking complementary categories in a text? And do you think one can grasp textual meaning from these? That would be a key question about structuralism. From here, at any rate, we can go on to a second station in the development of theory, and we'll do so on our next slide. So we can now consider post-structuralism. As you perhaps know, this emerged as a response to structuralism from a philosophical vantage point, and it has become best known for the key concept of deconstruction. As the word cloud, which you see here, can show, this has covered a range of fields of thought, and it does so by dismantling oppositions, rethinking linguistics, building on phenomenology, and building on signification. In the anthology by Rifkin and Ryan, in the second edition, you will find two excerpts from works by Jacques Derrida on pages 278 and following. And there is also the essay Structure, Sign, and Play from Writing and Difference. These are different from the excerpt by de Saussure that I was referring to just now. These are not lecture notes, such as Saussure's. These are complex philosophical discourses. So what are these like? Yes, we need to look a little more closely at what these are like. And you will find these on the next slide. Here, you find two brief excerpts. The first is from Différence in Jacques Derrida's Margins of Philosophy, and the second is from Of Grammatology. Let us consider these for a moment. Let's look at the first of these. Quote, "The verb to differ différer in French, seems to differ from itself. On the one hand, it indicates difference as a distinction, inequality, or discernibility. On the other, it expresses the interposition of delay, the interval of a pacing and temporalizing that puts off until later what is presently denied, the possible that is presently impossible. Sometimes the different and sometimes the deferred correspond, and that happens especially in French, to the verb to differ. This correlation, however, is not simply one between act and object, cause and effect, or primordial and derived. End of that quotation. This is from Margins of Philosophy by Jacques Derrida. The idea here is that, as in structuralism, signifiers gain their meaning from being different from each other. And then, going on from there, going on from structuralist thought, meaning is not to be fixed so soon, because it continues to develop throughout a textual network. And then, after that, we have the second excerpt. And this reads as follows, quote, "Yet if reading must not be content with doubling the text, it cannot legitimately transgress the text toward something other than it, toward a referent, a reality which is metaphysical, historical, psychobiographical, etc., or toward a signified outside the text, whose content could have taken place outside of language. That is to say, in the sense that we give here to that word, outside of writing in general." Okay, stop there. That is the second quotation excerpt. The idea here is that simple and uncritical reading just doubles the text without deriving any meaning from it. So text does not point toward a referent in the non-textual world outside of writing. All ingredients of meaning dwell in its texture. So these are two key statements here on the slide, which are fairly central to the thought of Jacques Derrida and of deconstruction. So how does this relate to structuralism? Well, let's see. You might remember that structuralism managed to develop a sense of order and tidiness and control. That is an advantage when we seek to find or perceive stable and paired opposites, you might remember. And this might appeal to you if you like to have order and stable conditions in the social world and in the discursive world around you. And if you value order and stable conditions in your life, well, then you might find structuralism plausible. You might find it adequate, and you might find it appealing to you. But we should ask, how does structuralism achieve this arrangement of tidiness and control and order? That happens because structuralism is a theory that looks mainly at form or actually at content. And it does not look at the context that surrounds any textual network. And for the same reason, it is basically ahistorical, which means non-historical. That is to say, again, it is not much concerned with how changes occur. And it doesn't consider temporal lines of development. Also, there is another potential problem. Structuralism seems to have a built-in contradiction when it considers language. Structuralism tells us that language constitutes and shapes the world, remember? But at the same time, it also looks for mostly tidy and stable patterns in textual structures. Can we really have these two ideas together logically? if language shapes our world, then can we really assume that there is any fixed pattern in it? Or that there is any fixed landmark beyond the working of language? I wonder if you see any contradiction in this. Let's say that we don't assume that we can find or that we can get any fixed landmark beyond language. If that is the case, then how can we gain any certain knowledge about anything? And that is exactly the question that came to be asked by thinkers whom we can call post-structuralists. They tend to doubt that we can assume the existence of any fixed landmark beyond language or even in language. The world is rather like, well, what you see here, the image on this slide. The situation of sitting in a train coach, in a track network. You're waiting for the train to move. There are other trains beside your train. Let's say that the train on your left begins to move on. Or is it your own train that's beginning to move? You cannot tell until you see a platform or the landscape. Okay. And now imagine that in this world, somebody has removed the fixed element, the fixed landscape. It doesn't come back. And all that's left is the moving trains around you. That sounds like a nightmare, doesn't it? Like a bad dream. Well, then normally you would wake up and the bad dream is over. But the post-structuralist does not wake up, you see. Would you like to live in such a world? But post-structuralism tells us it doesn't matter whether we like it. That's just the way it is. The world is counterintuitive, and common sense will not get us very far. So here, post-structuralism and especially deconstruction give us the term decentered universe. This means that there is no center, and likewise there is no margin. There is no direction in the world around us. It's like zero gravity in space, outer space. Do you find that a plausible way to conceive of the world around you and of your place in it, even if you are living on Earth and not in outer space? Well, if so, you will be less convinced by structuralism. So as Jonathan Culler has summarized it, deconstruction dismantles the hierarchical oppositions that have structured our thought, at least in Western culture. And these hierarchical oppositions are inside and outside, mind and body, presence and absence, nature and culture, speech and writing, literal and metaphorical, form and meaning, and a few others maybe. So when we deconstruct an opposition, we are aiming to show that it is not natural and inevitable and stable. It is only an artificial construction which is subject to a gentle modification. This aim, in fact, goes hand in hand with a related finding. The next slide will tell us more about that. You see, in post-structuralist thought, we meet with what has been called a high anxiety about language. That is because language can give us no fixed meanings. Language is slippery. It evades our control. And accordingly, in a literary text, there can be no fixed meaning. That, as it were, is the bad news. Instead, each text element gains meaning from all those around it. And accordingly, meaning can shift, it can develop, it can change its shape throughout a text. Do you remember the concept of difference and actually of différence in French, which we saw on a previous slide? This is where the concept fits in. And it takes place on more than one semantic level, not in a linear manner, on one single or cohesive level. And accordingly, a meaningful text consists of breaks, of ruptures, and gaps, and contradictions, and fault lines, without there being any single unity of meaning and purpose. Perhaps you're familiar with all this, and if so, again, you're welcome to let me know, and then we could simply pass on and skip the rest of this section. Deconstruction, at any rate, tells us that such breaks, contradictions, fault lines in a text do not spoil the text at all. Rather, they are what make it meaningful. So, once again, what about you? If you prefer to find unity and harmony around you and within a text which you read or which you would like to read, then you will not be partial to this way of thinking and analyzing. A deconstructive enterprise in itself hardly looks beyond a text toward its conditions of production. And it has been understood to claim that there is nothing outside a text which can be legitimately used to ascertain meaning. But we do not need to consider deconstruction as an insulated mode of thought. It is not on its own island somewhere remote from any other forms of theorizing. Deconstruction blends with some broader project. It blends with feminism, with psychoanalysis, with post-colonialism, and further ideas likewise. Obviously, we don't have the space or time for all of these, but we could pass on to consider feminism as an example of these. Are you ready for that? So surely you are aware that feminist thought calls attention to the particular conditions of women as an oppressed social group. And feminism seeks to contribute significantly to transforming and improving such conditions. Women's oppression can become strongly apparent in difficulties of motherhood, of domestic labor, of job discrimination, and of unequal wages. I don't know if any of that happens in Russia. You will be able to say more about that. But I can assure you it does happen in other countries. Of course, men are concerned about these issues too. So men do feminism as well as women. We might ask, how does that concern gender roles? Gender roles may seem to be fixed, but do they have to be? So if we turn again to the Rifkin and Ryan anthology, you will find the essays, or you might find the essays by Luce Irigaray, which you see there. You might find them relevant, and others as well. And you will find here, in quote, in this new matrix of history, in which man begets man as his own likeness, wives and then daughters and then sisters have value only in that they serve as the possibility of and the potential benefit in relations among men. So Irigaray is arguing here that women serve only the functioning of relations among men. Men are using women as pawns in their own game, as it were. And that is what gives women their value. So the reigning paradigm is masculine homosexuality. You find that here in the middle of that passage. Homo with one M and with two M's. Alternatively, this means the same sex as well as restricted to men. And women are then used, as it were, or exploited in order to uphold this regime. Maybe that is what all of us have a share in doing. Irigaray speaks of mirror games Mirror games are images that depict such gender relations. And these mirror games are vital for the working of the patriarchal regime. Accordingly, an equal participation of women would be foreign to the social order. And thinking of mirror games and of identity discourses can reveal a sexual ideology. And remember what we were saying about ideology? We hold ideologies below the level of consciousness in our own minds, and they tend to govern some or much or all of our thinking and our articulations. So you see, we can find a sexual ideology in the way in which women and men image themselves and each other in a male-dominated society. And these images and these notions can be clearly visible on the social surface, or they can be beneath that level. More often, more effectively, such sexual ideology can be deeply unconscious. You see, I myself, being a male professor from a Western country, I may have unconscious notions of men's and of women's roles in society. Maybe I am acting on such notions without realizing it. So, sexism and the normal or accepted gender role are issues which engage the deepest personal dimensions of human life for each of us, for you and for me. And Irigaray, in her further context, speaks of jamming the theoretical machinery. And that indeed has happened. This is the idea that theorizing has been a masculine enterprise, and women should not advance or become involved in that exercise. There has also been the idea that we should call so much attention to women's sufferings that other forms of discrimination, other forms of oppression, do not deserve the same attention. Indeed, there is a hierarchical opposition between men and women that seems to have lasted for most of the history of our species. In all periods, about a half of humanity has been banished and subjected as inferior to the other half. I would invite you to think about whether you have any experience with this happening, and if so, what it has meant or what it means for you. So a deconstructive approach then seeks to undermine, to split apart fixed and hierarchical gender roles whenever they appear in a fictional representation. And accordingly, feminist analysis investigates the ways in which literature reinforces, or alternatively, undermines the economic, political, social, and psychological oppression of women. So literature can reinforce the oppression, or it can undermine the oppression. So as you may be quite aware, feminism asks such questions as the following, which you see here. This is a short catalog. Is the author of this text male or female? Is the text narrated by a male or female? What types of roles do women have in the text? Are the female characters the protagonists, or are they secondary or minor characters? Do any stereotypical characterizations of women appear? And what are the attitudes toward women held by the male characters? I wonder if you know further questions like this. If you believe that such questions are worth examining, then feminism may appear a meaningful and worthwhile pursuit to you. Modernist writer Virginia Woolf certainly thought so. In one of her best-known essays, Virginia Woolf asks, what would have happened if William Shakespeare had had a sister, one who was every bit as brilliant as he was? Well, this is what would have happened. Quote, Meanwhile, his extraordinarily gifted sister, let us suppose, remained at home. She was as adventurous, as imaginative, as agog to see the world as he was. But she was not sent to school. She had no chance of learning grammar and logic, let alone of reading Horace and Virgil. She picked up a book now and then, one of her brothers perhaps, and she read a few pages. But then her parents came in and told her to mend the stockings or mind the stews and not moon about with books and papers. End of that quote. So much for the possible fate and for the possible talent and gift of William Shakespeare's sister. Yes, we might say, but feminism is often under attack. We sometimes hear that feminism is not pro-woman, it is actually just anti-man. Is male domination the root cause of tragedy, of a tragic development in a literary work? Are the characters to be defined as either men or women, and not just as humans? Is there constant and consistent oppression from patriarchy? And of course, what about masculinity? Is masculinity inherently violent? So all these are questions about each of us. What do you think? Would you see yourself as being most importantly a woman, or most importantly a man in any situation? Or would you see yourself mainly as a human person, and only sometimes as being female or male? You see, it is then likely to be similar when you encounter literary characters, and you will read or view such characters in light of how you think about yourself. When a female literary character is subjected to oppression, then why? Is it because she is a woman? At any rate, we could aim to deconstruct the seemingly fixed roles of men and of women in social discourse. But beyond this, we can also do something more. And we can deconstruct the working of our conscious and rational mind, the kind of mind that tells us that we as men do not oppress any women, that we do not believe we are superior to any women, or if you're a woman, that you are necessarily somehow inferior in society to men. That is our rational mind. And our conscious will. We can deconstruct that. And this is what happens in classic psychoanalysis. In the Rifkin and Ryan anthology, you'll find an overview about this. In this school of thought, a person's identity is seen as being formed by a process of identification with some other. Sigmund Freud has studied this intensively. And Freud finds that such identification shapes the personality or the self for each of us. We are not consciously aware of how it happens. We do not control it. And as a consequence, the basis of sexual identity is an identification with a parent. A young child desires just as the same-sex parent does, so that one imitates the parent's desire, and accordingly becomes a rival who is competing for the object of desire. In the so-called Oedipus Complex, as you surely know, and as Freud assumes, a young boy identifies with the father and desires the mother. I wonder if you have ever come across any situation in which this appears to be happening. So in reconstructing early childhood experience, psychoanalysis belongs with post-structuralism, as Jonathan Culler points out for us. And that is because it replays a kind of text that one cannot master, that one cannot control. And it does so with a transcendental signifier. and the transcendental signified remains elusive. So that is the final concept that we can turn to, though our discussion has had to be very brief about this. So, where are we? We have a range of theories. We have looked at a few of those and at their key ideas. Hopefully, we have at least a little insight, simplified insight, into structuralism, into post-structuralism, feminism, and even as far as psychoanalysis. There are more theory concepts, of course, than these, all the way to post-humanism and to the Anthropocene. But unfortunately, we cannot cover much more within our space. What can we do with it? Well, what we can do is to make a choice, each of us, between theoretical concepts. There may be some that you find plausible, fruitful. There are some which appear otherwise and the opposite to you. So if you wish, you can make a choice. Or we might look for subtle connections, linkages between such concepts. Each of them has had a great influence, and in several ways, each continues to have an impact on our analytical reading. So we're talking about reading once again. Are you ready for such a reading? Are you ready for some actual literature? Well, if you are, can we together attempt an analytical reading of a truly major work of literature? William Shakespeare's tragedy, Hamlet. And this is where we can move on to our final major section. I wonder if you've ever become acquainted with Hamlet. Maybe in a theater production, maybe in a movie adaptation, or even by reading a printed script in English or in a translation. We could try to read this tragedy without modern theory. If we do so, it would mean that we are still acting on some theory assumptions, which we should then acknowledge. We may not be aware of them. So we could try that first. And then we could ask whether and how any of this range of modern theories gives us a new or a different understanding of that work. So let's approach Hamlet, on which I myself have published a little study a few years ago. If you have a good knowledge of this tragedy, I must confess, you'll find our treatment right now rather elementary. But let's see. You may be aware that Hamlet is a blood revenge drama. It's about the existential dilemma of a young university student who is forced to drop out. It begins in a somber mood and in darkness. We are outdoors in a dark winter night on the ramparts of Elsinore Castle. There are guards on the ramparts, which is highly unusual and only happens in times of strong alarm, as in wartime. But there is no war. The country is at peace. Why are there guards outside in the cold and dark? At first, we only get hints. Then, we gather that the guards have seen the ghost of King Hamlet there. That king has very suddenly died, although he had enjoyed robust health. Nobody was prepared for his death. Because of his sudden death, his brother Claudius has become the new ruler. And right away, the Queen Gertrude, who was Hamlet's wife, has married Claudius. Right away. The king's son, young Prince Hamlet, has just been recalled from university abroad because of these sudden events. And now, a ghost. The characters don't believe in ghosts. But what does that tell us about the constitution of the human? You see, this is exactly how the play gets going. All those around the prince have adjusted quickly to that new situation without asking any questions, none at all. Nobody even speaks of the king and his sudden death. How is that possible? How can the queen switch right away to a new love? How can she dote on him? None of this makes any sense to the young prince as he arrives home. He intuits that something is very wrong, but nobody listens to him. And now, a ghost? The prince has a friend, a fellow student by the name of Horatio. Horatio is an intellectual who, like everybody else, and like you and me, does not believe in ghosts. But Horatio has just seen a ghost, and he doesn't know what to make of this experience. So Horatio asks his friend, the prince, to watch with the guards up there at midnight in the cold on the ramparts. And indeed, the ghost appears in front of the group. The ghost declares that he is exactly what he looks like. He is King Hamlet, and that he has just been brutally murdered by his brother Claudius, the prince's uncle, so that the ghost calls on his son to avenge his death, which means killing Claudius. This self-centered demand gives the prince a task that will determine his life, perhaps destroys his life. But then, well, what happens then is nothing. The prince doesn't do much about his bloody task. He first has to shield himself, because Claudius might think the prince to be a danger to him. As the king's son, after all, the prince himself has a claim to the royal throne. So the prince has to appear harmless and not threatening. How can he do that? He decides the best way is to pretend that he has lost his mind for some reason and he has gone mad. During most of the play, then, the hero is pretending to be mad. Or is he really mad at times? Can he fully control his mind? And indeed, can he trust anybody around him? From here, we could go on tracing what happens in this complex play, but let's pause to ask instead, how can we seek to investigate it more accurately? We can ask how we would study Hamlet without using any modern theory. And I might ask, how would you do it? What would you focus on without any modern theory? What methods would you tend to use for this purpose? Well, let's see. We might want to find out with what devices characters like Claudius and Horatio and Gertrude are portrayed in the play, whether they are static or dynamic characters. We would study their speeches to find out how characters speak with stylistic analysis. Then, we might ask whether there are signs of any inner conflict in certain characters, such as Hamlet and Claudius. We would inquire about the time covered in the dramatic action. How many days does the action show? Do characters look back to explain anything that happened earlier before the play began? How do particular scenes form a sequence? We might like to search for a harmonious unity in the work and in its ethical meaning. After all, a crime has been committed. A son devotes himself to his father's cause, and poetic justice is restored when the heroic avenger runs down the criminal. So that is what a non-theorized analysis might give us. Is there any added value that we can gain from modern theory? Well, we could explore this. Let us consider how structuralism would approach this play. Do you remember the structuralist paradigm? Well, we certainly find patterns of parallels and opposites. Just think of the thematic pairing of father and son. Young Hamlet is parallel to two other young men in the play, who have all lost their fathers to killing or murder, and who all have a cause for revenge. They are Laertes and Fortinbras. When they each seek revenge, are their methods the same? Then we get further paired opposites. We get mother, son, natural and supernatural, sanity and madness, loyalty and treachery, avenger and murderer. And this play has pattern parallels with the structure of other dramas in the revenge drama genre. These have similar plot and theme features. So the single work cannot be understood without its belonging to a genre. We can compare the handling of such parallels. Then within the tragedy of Hamlet, parallelism spirals, and it goes on spiraling, almost ad infinitum, the more closely you look. The play itself becomes parallel when we get an inserted mini-play right at the center, creating a mirror for the larger play. Of course, you have come across this play's most famous speech, which young Hamlet delivers halfway through in Act 3, Scene 1. It begins with, "To be or not to be? That is the question." So very clearly, the prince is a structuralist, and he pushes us right into a binary opposite as the key to analyzing the whole play. So surely structuralist categories are perfect for making sense of this tragedy. It's a structuralist play. Would you agree? But is that right? Would a post-structuralist approach see the drama in the same way? Let's see. We might be aware that this drama exists in more than one version, so that we have a textual indeterminacy which deconstructs itself. And we could probably talk for half an hour about that alone. But instead, let's come back to the binary opposition that we just mentioned, natural and supernatural. That's the ghost. Deconstructionists tell us, you might remember, that meanings play with each other throughout a work, and they leave traces in each other. So remember, we just spoke of Hamlet's speech, "To be or not to be." This too includes binary opposition, right? What happens when we read the supernatural in light of these paired opposites and of this speech? We immediately get the question of being in the sense of presence. And so, is the ghost present? How? The ghost is not alive. He says he is the dead king. But watch out. We have scripted discourse. This is an actor who plays a presence in pretending to be a ghost, who pretends to be a dead king. But is it? The castle guards who are horrified are played by actors too. So are any guards actually present? Or is it the actors already producing an illusion? I hope you can still follow this. Deconstruction tells us that there is no pure presence. Any presence is embraced by a presence of absence. We've come across these two categories before near the beginning of our lecture for the first time. So when we think we see guards and a ghost, the actors are absent from our mind. Yet they, the actors, are all that we see. To be or not to be. So what being appears here? The ghost is absent from the living world, yet we witness its semi-real presence just for a few moments, then it will disappear again. But the ghost will still be present throughout all of Hamlet's actions and through all reactions of other characters. And it hovers over the further action in Act 3 when it reappears. Jacques Derrida as the leading philosopher of deconstruction, tells us that a presence like that of the guards on the castle ramparts, a presence requires a supplement, which is something that relates to preceding passing moments, so that we always have the supplement of or from the origin. And that is the origin of actors learning a role, and the origin of what we see when we think we see a ghost. The dynamics of illusion. We as audience share Hamlet's strong desire to pin it down without différance. So where is the ghost's origin? Is the ghost really the dead king? Or just a usurper, just like Claudius? Derrida tells us that the idea of supplement, which is the idea of an absence intertwined with presence, that this wrenches language, like the ghost's utterances, from that which it must or ought to have been and what it has never been. It could only have been born by suspending its relation to all origin. So that is Jacques Derrida. Now that sounds difficult, right? Well, we could read it like this. The ghost's speech must have been that of Hamlet's father, but because it's absent from a living body, that suggests it is something that has never been. It might not be that father. So the young prince, who is a late teenager, doesn't know where to place the ghost's origin. It's only halfway through the play that he feels more certain, and that is after he suddenly becomes able to have a little play staged for the whole court society. And here it is. At this play within play, Uncle Claudius and Queen Gertrude, his new wife, are prominently present. And they see a little play that enacts precisely the murder that Claudius was alleged to have committed. An illusion. Hamlet is watching his uncle very closely throughout this little performance. He is watching every movement at every second. And indeed, Claudius rises in turmoil, shocked and disturbed, just as Hamlet was hoping. And yet, what is it that shocks Claudius? A rendering of his crime? Outrage at the prince's wild suspicions? We have a matter of stage actors pretending to be other stage actors who are pretending to be a king and his brother and his wife. So again, we have a convolution, an interplay of presence and absence, of fluid signifiers, and that has to serve as a basis for knowledge. Is it any wonder that all this drives the young prince mad? Or does the prince just want those around him, except his friend Horatio maybe, to think that he is mad? Again, to be or not to be. So we have a mutual enveloping of presence and absence. They wrap themselves around each other. Actually, it's especially strong right at the very end of the play. Let us see. We get a string of incredibly swift actions. And in that string of swift actions, all the major players kill each other, either by sword or by poison. The sole survivor is Hamlet's friend, Horatio. At this moment, a foreign army bursts on the scene, led by the young Norwegian ruler Fortinbras, who is ready to take over Denmark. They are shocked at the carnage, at the litter of dead bodies strewn on the floor of the central chamber of Elsinore. Whatever has happened here? They have no clue as they carry off the body of Hamlet, as you see it here. So in the play's last lines, Horatio, Hamlet's friend, who has survived, the only survivor, offers to tell Fortinbras and his generals, and hence us, and also Shakespeare, the story that has led to this mass killing. But then, what have we been seeing throughout 5 acts of stage performance? What have we been seeing? Can we trust Horatio? Is he skewing that story for some advantage of his own, covering himself? Horatio wasn't actually present in all the scenes. Again, we have the presence and absence interplay. These questions burst the mold of dramatic illusion. And these questions are teased out for the audience. So now it's a strongly deconstructive play, isn't it? Or is all this just hair splitting and leads nowhere? Is that too much philosophizing? Should we turn instead to feminism? Maybe that can give us a firmer grasp of fixity in reality. But just possibly, at this point, our regular time is up, and that firmer grasp will have to come for anybody who is interested as a supplement, for anyone who might have more time for such a supplement. So I would say many thanks indeed for your attention to these remarks thus far. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. My very best wishes to you. And if you would like to discuss, or if you have any questions about what we've been doing so far, you are very welcome to do so. And you are very welcome to ask your questions and to engage me in a discussion. Time is already very late, as I see. So we might not even have time for any such supplementary remarks. All right. Thank you very much. My very best wishes to you. And I would be very happy to field and to entertain any questions which you may have for a discussion. Thank you.
Professor Штеппат, thank you so much. We placed our questions in the chat.
Oh, yes.
Can you see them?
Let me see. I have to open the function of chats. And in order to open that, let us see. This will not yet open on my function. Yes. All right, I probably need to unmute myself. I should exit that, and I should, okay. Can you hear me? Can anybody hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, very good. So I'm unmuted. Thank you for these questions. I ought to start at the top here. And as I see here, how contemporary literary trends affect the teaching of a literary course. Literary trends, I take it that that means theoretical trends and trends of conceptualizing. And I can assure you that in the academic systems that I know and where I actively teach, yes, theoretical assumptions are very important, but that depends on the level of teaching. For the early stages of undergraduate teaching, you would not want to introduce theories, modern theories. They can be, or they can appear a little too demanding, challenging, abstract. At the advanced levels, yes. And in academic literature courses in Germany at the advanced level, theories are very important indeed for teaching literary works in various genres. We need narratology for fiction, for instance. We haven't touched on narratology. We need the legacy of structuralism and of signifying systems. So yes, I would say these are very important. I don't have unlimited time, so I should probably make my answers fairly short. Then I have a question which I see here. In terms of perceptive structure of reading that you described, can we see the process of reading bearing any resemblance to deconstruction as Derrida puts it? Yes, reading is rewriting. Reading is critical reading. It is creating or recreating the text. Because if we don't do that, we are just doubling the text. And doubling the text is Derrida's category for a reading in which we just follow what the author gives us. And we are not generating meanings out of a search for the cracks and fault lines and ruptures within a text. So that would be if you appreciate deconstruction. If you don't appreciate deconstruction, then you will not be bound to deconstructive methodology. And then you might prefer feminism, you might prefer posthumanism, you might prefer psychoanalysis, and you might try to detach those from deconstruction. Not very easy, because nowadays many schools of thought feed on deconstructive ideas and notions of the supplement, of the trace, of the absence-presence interplay, and of some others. So it's not quite easy to get away from the legacy of deconstructive thought in a range of theories. All right, then I have a question here. Whether I consider the most authoritative, who is the most authoritative literary theorist among contemporary Russian researchers and the Soviet ones? Gosh, I wish I knew more about them. But I would say, especially, not contemporary, but Mikhail Bakhtin. Bakhtin is a leading intellectual guide for many of us, perhaps all of us, in thinking about any kind of narrative literature. We get narrativity in fiction, in poetry and drama, and in any narrative genres. So Mikhail Bakhtin, yes. Then I'm sure there are more Russian thinkers, and in fact, I can probably think of 2 or 3. If I were to turn to my notes, I would find more references. And yes, Russian thinkers, philosophers, as well as literary theorists. You probably know more about very interesting contemporary Russian researchers than I do, I'm afraid, at this stage. Then there's a question, the disadvantaged books. How can we tell a poorly written book about an underprivileged individual from a book of considerable literary value? I would say, is the book in question what Roland Barthes would call a writerly text or a readerly text? This is related to Derrida's category of doubling a text or generating a text. You as reader generate a text. You can only do so if the text appeals to you to generate meanings. If a text consists of stereotypes, the characters are flat, they do not develop, they are static. The settings are described in thoroughly hackneyed and conventional terms without particularization and without any relation to the actual situation. Then you're probably dealing with a poor book, which we would not think of as one to be read critically to generate meanings, because there are no meanings in such works. And sometimes we read such works just for light entertainment. We don't want to think too much about it. We just want some cardboard characters and stereotypes. And that would be for recreation, for leisure. But that's not literature. Yes, thank you for that question. Then I wish I could read Russian, but I need to go and skip further down to the question. John Ronald wrote Tolkien, yes indeed, spoke in his essay of fairy stories that fantastic literature is an escape from reality. What do you think? Is it possible to say this about all literature? Not really, because there are literary works which we read because we think they take us out of our immediate surroundings. They invent surroundings which are remote from ours. We appreciate that. We relish it. There are no monsters in our lives. The kinds of mythical griffin creatures that we find in fantasy literature. But, in fact, fantasy literature offers more than that. The whole appeal of fantasy literature is to tell us something about our existence, about our life, so that we think we're escaping for a moment from our real life, but through a kind of back door, we always come back. It's the same with science fiction. Just like fantasy literature, which takes us out of our wonted, our accustomed surroundings for just a moment, but it only does so because it wants to tell us something about ourselves and about our lives. And Tolkien, in other contexts, has said what he wants to do. He wants to tell us that our modern life is governed by many categories which were familiar to the Middle Ages. And in that regard, he has a lot in common with T.S. Eliot. So that in looking back at the escape route that we can perhaps travel along in fantasy literature, we do come back to our time in literary theory, literary analysis, strongly or less strongly theory-driven, will usually analyze fantasy literature exactly for that quality of commenting on our own social reality and our social discourses. Yes, did I miss any of these questions? Did I fail to answer something? As I said, I'm afraid I cannot adequately read the posts that are written in Russian. Please excuse me and forgive me for that.
Professor, it's just a technical post. Thank you so much.
All right.
It's not a question.
Thank you very much. Are there any further questions or impulses for discussion? You might remember what I've not been able to do, we didn't have the time for that, is to give an illustration of how one can understand Shakespeare's Hamlet from a feminist perspective. And you might think that is very marginal because the female characters, there are two mainly, in that play are very marginal, but that might only be a superficial view and a superficial understanding. And analyzing the role and the presence, the dramatic presence of these two marginal women can again give us unique insights into the whole drama, and also help us to see what actually happens with patriarchal structures, which are supposed to be so pervasive and dominant, suddenly they disappear. And these are questions which one can also discuss and analyze in an extension of what we've been able to do in this lecture. If there are any other questions forthcoming or impulses for a discussion, I'll be very happy to pick them up and to respond to them.
Вас не слышно, вас не слышно. Екатерина Яковлевна, не слышно вас.
Господин Штеппат, разрешите поблагодарить вас от лица ректора университета, доктора юридических наук, доктора педагогических наук Елену Александровну Певцову, а также от той большой широкой аудитории, которая сегодня присутствовала на вашей лекции. Это студенты, бакалавры, магистры, аспиранты и руководство факультетов романо-германских языков, лингвистического факультета и факультета русской филологии. Очень интересная, конструктивная беседа, разговор. Мы надеемся на наше дальнейшее сотрудничество и что после пандемии когда-нибудь мы с вами встретимся офлайн.
Dear Professor, I would like to thank you from the name of our rector, PhD Professor Elena Pevtsova, and from all our students and professors on your lecture were students from the linguistic faculty, from Roman-Germanic faculty, Russian philology, and we were glad to listen to your lecture. It was rather fruitful, and we would like once more to thank you for it, and we would like to highlight that we are glad to see our further collaboration, and after all this pandemic we would like to meet you and to continue our collaboration. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. It's been a real privilege for me to be allowed to speak to you today and to discuss questions with you. Thank you for your attention, for your careful participation in this event. I've really enjoyed this, and I look forward to the next opportunities when we can exchange ideas. I've been asked to present a lecture on the German excellence strategy in research, the topmost level of research in Germany. I'm currently preparing that, and we will arrange a suitable time and format for presenting that material in probably a few weeks from now. So I'm very happy to be able to participate and to cooperate with your institution and with my colleagues right there at the regional university. Thank you so much for today, and my very best wishes to you. Goodbye for now.
Thank you so much. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.